Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce this particular topic. It's an issue that I have personally been working on for some time, and some of you might remember it's definitely come up at some of our coalition conferences in the past. So I'm going to turn it right over so we can spend all the time talking about the content on digital surveillance. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. So I'll be brief just before I introduce our panelists. My name is Ishan. I'll be moderating today's panel. And I'm a fellow and advisor at the Federation of American Scientists, a science and tech nonprofit that was founded in 1945 by members of the Manhattan Project to reduce the risk of nuclear war through scientific expertise, a mission that remains true today and has evolved to address new threats in science and tech in the 21st century. One of those threats is what we're here to speak to you today about, the rise of global digital repression. Now, this crowd may be familiar with the term, but for those who are not, digital repression is quite a broad swath term. It includes things like internet shutdowns, censorship, as well as employing new ways to monitor the chat rooms and built environments. Today's discussion may touch on several of these elements, but just at the outset, it is primarily focused on a specific slice of the digital repression problem, the emergence of 21st century surveillance technologies and methods, what they make possible for dictators and authoritarian regimes, and most importantly, what they demand of democracies. It is this last part, what does the emergence of surveillance technology demand of democracy, that we hope to fully investigate. Our focus on surveillance tech allows us a chance to evaluate what the democratic response has been and what it should be. It is an issue that raises questions of police reforms, racial justice, and ethical development at home, as well as abroad, with emergent novel and national security and foreign policy threats. In short, one takeaway I hope you have from this discussion is that rather than categorizing the world into a series of us versus them questions, are they democracies or are they not? A far more interesting inquiry is investigating how surveillance tech accelerates digital repression in both free and unfree societies. In essence, digital repression occurs everywhere to different degrees. Now, collectively as panelists, we agree on a lot, and please correct me in the ensuing discussion if I'm wrong here. We agree that the rise of digital repression is a serious problem that needs to be stopped. We also agree that the current response from democracies to bolster human rights protections at home and abroad have been noble but insufficient. Attempts to ban certain types of tech, their export, or the companies that make them are important, but cannot fully address a world in which surveillance tech industry is globalized with production sources from multiple non-Western countries. Nor is it equipped to deal with the reality that surveillance tech business is booming across the world. Now, what we do not agree on, and what I hope we can dig into a bit today, is precisely how America and liberal democracies can lead by example in addressing the problem of digital repression. What is the model and how do we get there? So with this framing for today's discussion, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. So first, up on the screen, we have Nanjala Nyabola, who is a Kenyan writer and researcher. Her work focuses on the intersection between technology, media, and society. She's the author of 2 books, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, and Traveling While Black, essays inspired by life on the move. Nanjala also serves on the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism to the UN Secretary General. Nanjala, it's been a pleasure to get to know you these past few months. Thank you so much for dialing in. Next is Dr. Chris Meserole in the flesh. Dr. Meserole is a fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution, director of research for the Brookings Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative, and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. His research focuses on 2 major streams. One is the use and impact of AI on military applications, in which he has advised senior US and European officials on ethical principles and policy frameworks for lethal autonomous weapons, as well as taken part in the US-China Track 2 dialogue on AI security. The second stream of work is his focus on digital authoritarianism. He focuses particularly on the exploitation of smartphones, remote sensors, and other digital tools by both extremist movements and authoritarian governments in accelerating and exporting authoritarianism around the world. Chris, thanks for being here. Next, Sarah Un, up on the screen as well, is a human rights technologist. You can find her somewhere between Brooklyn and Beirut, working on issues of security, privacy, internet freedom, and transformative justice with activists, journalists, and high-risk communities. Sarah has spent years delivering numerous trainings on operational and digital security and has worked with several groups and NGOs to set up organizational security practices. Sarah also recently served as Vice President of Security and Chief Technology Officer for the Open Technology Fund, an independent nonprofit organization committed to advancing global internet freedom by researching, developing, and implementing sustainable technologies that counteract repressive censorship. Sarah was also a Ford Mozilla Open Web Fellow, an Internet Freedom Fellow, and an advisor to the Internet Freedom Festival, the Human Rights Foundation, and Global Journalist Security. Sarah, thanks for serving as a waypoint as I've grown my own research these past few years. And lastly, but not least, Stephen Feldstein is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on issues of democracy, technology, human rights, and U.S. foreign policy. He previously served as the holder of the Frank and Bethune Church Chair of Public Affairs and an associate professor at Boise State University, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau, U.S. Department of State, where he had responsibility for Africa policy, international labor affairs, and international religious freedom. Stephen has also served as Director of Policy at the U.S. Agency for International Development and as counsel on the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Stephen is the author of the recent book, The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. In more ways than one, Stephen's work is what first brought me to this issue and why I'm here speaking with you today. So I think that's actually a great place to start. One question I have for the panelists as I migrate forward will be, what worries you most about this ecosystem and problem of digital repression? What sparked your interest? And what are some trends that you've been noticing recently that you were particularly focused on? So Nanjala, if we can perhaps go to you first to answer, and I'll moderate going forward.
Thanks, Ishan. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm traveling. And if I start yawning, it's not because it's boring, it's because it's very late where I am. So digital authoritarianism. I guess my interest in digital actually is entirely rooted in politics and thinking about the intersection between technology and politics. I think a lot of times when we are thinking about innovation, we focus on how human action transforms objects, but it's equally important, I find, and I argue in my research, to understand how objects transform people and how especially they transform society and social connection. And thinking about technology as a political scientist raises a lot of really interesting questions, and especially as someone who's coming at it from a rights perspective, because I think there's been a systematic process. First, we were just not paying attention to the issues that were coming up. And then when the issues came up, it's kind of like the train had left the station, and now we're trying to do a lot of retroactive addressing the challenges that have been created, but also then still trying to be proactive and trying to think ahead of the ideas and the innovations that are coming down the pipeline. So at the same time as we're trying to think about regulations about speech and freedom of expression and platforms that have been with us for 10, 15 years, we're also trying to think about artificial intelligence that hasn't even been built yet, autonomous weapons that haven't even been perfected yet, and trying to create a regulatory climate, try to create a social climate in which all of these technologies intersect positively with human life. So our work on digital authoritarianism, and I'm speaking here as the former director of AdVox, which is the digital rights project at Global Voices, was looking at the specific aspect of digital authoritarianism. And it came from this perspective that First of all, authoritarianism is not an event, it's a process. And everybody who lives in an authoritarian regime will tell you that you don't just wake up one morning and find yourself under an authoritarian regime. Rather, what happens is a slow erosion of rights, of the commons, of society, of community, of the links that make societies work. And there not being sufficient protection for the people who are resisting this erosion, so that those people are taking tremendous risk, like many of the Egyptian activists who are in jail right now, even while the world gathers in Sharm el-Sheikh for the COP 27. And we have at the same time it's a slow process of erosion and failure for the people who are not immediately affected to pay attention, to people who are outside the country not paying attention to the developments within the country. So combining that with the digital, what we were paying attention to in our research that we're calling the Unfreedom Monitor was looking at how technology intersects with this process. Instead of beginning with a technology, instead of beginning with this particular surveillance technology or this particular biometric technology, we started with the societies, and we started to look at the state of the human rights in those various societies, and particularly the state of digital rights in those societies, and how technology was being used to curb rights in those societies. And we looked at our first sample was 11 countries. We've now gone up to 22 countries. And we were basically asking ourselves, well, this is the rights landscape in these various countries from all over the world, Russia, Turkey, Morocco, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, different political structures. You know, we had military regimes, we have nominally democratically elected regimes, we had authoritarian regimes that had overstayed, extended their mandates. We had people who were democratically elected. Bolsonaro in Brazil, he was elected in what was a free and fair plebiscite. But then we looked at the state of freedom of expression, the state of freedom of information, the state of the freedom of the press, the rights of women, especially in the public sphere, and connecting all of this with the developments that were happening in the digital. And what we found was common threads that unite countries that you wouldn't expect to be united. Oftentimes, because of the structures, I guess, of post-colonialism and how we imagine the geographies of the post-colony, we tend to think about countries in regional clumps. So when we bring up an African country, then everybody thinks that the logical comparison is to compare it to another African country. We wanted to do a global analysis because we found that the technologies of surveillance and the technologies of repression, they don't travel by these post-colonial border constructs. They are bought and sold almost, at will, although there's increasing pushback against that, regardless of where the country finds itself, because money doesn't have a nationality. Money goes wherever it is demanded. And so in this sample of countries, we found these various threads that we found that I can sort of tease out. I want to tease out like 2 or 3 that I think will illuminate this conversation. The first that I really want to tease out is the connection between the rights of women in the public sphere and digital repression. And I think when I say this, people immediately go to countries in the Middle East and they think, well, that's that, and this is us, and this is completely different. But we actually found a strong correlation between coordinated, authentic behavior that targets women who are in the public space and a few years down the line, sort of an expansion in repression and the freedom of the press in general. So journalists in Brazil, beginning with female journalists, receiving sustained attacks on their reporting, and that sort of morphing into more sustained and more coordinated attacks against the press and against freedom of expression in the country. We found that a lot of countries that are on paper liberal democracies were actually significant purveyors of especially surveillance tech, but generally the technologies of repression. And this is something that I think also has a lot of bearing on this panel. So you could be a liberal democracy domestically and could be touting, the values of liberal democracy. But if you're buying and selling the technology that is enabling repression abroad, to what extent are you living up to your liberal democratic bona fides? So we had countries like Italy through the hacking team, which has sold surveillance technology in many Latin American countries. We have Pegasus that we all heard of, which is sold out of Israel to countries of all stripes and has enabled all kinds of repression all over the world. 20 journalists in El Salvador finding themselves imprisoned because their phones were hacked by the government using technology that was built in Israel by a company that has many Americans on its management board. we found a lot of these kinds of tensions, between the general perception, these countries not being at risk and not being receiving the significant amount of attention that they deserve, and sort of going under the radar in terms of because of, I think, what Ishan talked about, this consumption with this typology that there are good countries and there are bad countries. Some of these countries kind of going under the radar and not getting the sustained attention that they need in terms of what they're adding to, if we could call it, the repression value chain, if we could call it that. And I think the last thing that I would probably want to draw our attention to is that it is impossible for digital authoritarianism to remain contained by geographical considerations. I think what we're seeing right now in the world right now, this moment that we're in the world right now, didn't start overnight. It's the culmination of a slow process of erosion that's been happening. And I think for the last 20 years, the narrative has been China bad, West good. But what we found, for example, is China isn't actually a big seller of surveillance technology. Now, that's a really big statement of hacking technology, I should say, but surveillance in the broadest sense of the word. So, for example, in countries like Zimbabwe, the government does buy a significant amount of Chinese technology for their policing system and what they're calling their smart cities. And we do find these economic relationships exist in a lot of countries, especially those that are marginalized from the global economic system because of political reasons, sanctions, military regimes, etc. However, this lack of attention to what's happening from countries that are nominally democratic is actually a huge vulnerability, both in the exportation of that technology, but also then what happens within the country in question. Because a lot of these technologies are first tested on domestic populations and vulnerable domestic populations before they're exported overseas. When we think about the Palestinian population in Gaza and the West Bank, that is where a lot of this surveillance technology is perfected. When we think about refugee and migrant populations in Europe, who live outside a lot of the rights frameworks for biometrics and privacy laws, a lot of that technology then being expanded in use in the rest of the country. So we think about policing in the United States and how surveillance tech is used against Black populations and minority populations before being embedded in other societies. So really, overall, what we are saying is that this is a global threat, and a global threat that demands a global response, but a global response that is rooted in justice and equality and inclusiveness, a global threat that isn't rooted in myths of exceptionalism and exemption, because ultimately, the way these technologies are moving around the world, our notions of borders, our notions of closed geographies just don't necessarily hold up the way we would want them to. And what we're doing instead of, if we are avoiding these uncomfortable political conversations, is we're kicking down the can until we end up in a situations like what we have in Europe now, where we have some countries in the EU that are sort of gone over a tipping point, and therefore creating a political challenge for the entire bloc, which now has to deal with the fallout from that. So I'm going to stop there and invite reflection on those issues.
Angela, thank you so much for sharing that. I think so much of what you shared is relevant to the discussion, particularly in the context of it being a shared democratic struggle or a shared struggle abroad for freedom, whether it's abortion surveillance in southern states in the United States, or it's Iranian women suffering from surveillance issues as they protest. So thank you so much for the work that you are doing and for detailing these large themes. Stephen, I want to pass it to you because I think a lot of what Nanjala shared in terms of this global analysis relates very closely to the work that you've done in terms of research. So I would invite you to pick up on any of these themes, as well as more broadly, what do you think is perhaps missing from from how we move from the global threat to this sort of response in an inclusive fashion?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again for organizing this panel. It's really great to be here, both virtually and in person. I want to pick up on a few themes, and I think a lot of really good issues have been put on the table, most of which I agree with. So I want to build off a few ideas. I think one of the things that's shifted a lot since I first started doing research in this area, and when I first started thinking a lot about digital repression around 2016 or so, when I became aware of a lot of the digitally oriented abuses occurring in China, in Xinjiang in particular. And at the time, it seemed very very unique and very chilling in terms of what we were learning about integrated data collection platforms that are being used by security forces in the region, by the use of incorporation of facial recognition, license plate recognition, later on DNA genomic surveillance, and so forth. And I still find it shocking in terms of the scale of what's occurred. But I think what is also surprising is how quickly a lot of these methods have spread, and how much they spread in all kinds of political contexts, both authoritarian, hybrid, as well as democratic. And so the idea that I think even just a few years ago, that we would be relying on facial recognition searches and facial recognition devices and smartphones as a way to bring accountability to, for example, the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., no longer causes surprise. And I think it shows you the spread in which these techniques have found their way around the world. And so one thing I wanted to, one thought I wanted to really emphasize is the increasing ubiquity of these technologies, of surveillance technologies, but other related repression technologies as well, and their proliferation of them around the world in all sorts of political contexts. I think a second thing that is important to think about when it comes to digital technology is that, I think that sometimes the field can suffer from a bit of technological determinism in terms of the technology driving our understanding of how repression works, or even, sort of pushing out motivations. But I really think that understanding individual political contexts is extremely important in terms of better understanding how strategies and tactics apply and use these technologies. So in the book that I wrote on the rise of digital repression that came out last year, one of the things I spent a lot of time doing was carrying out 3 case studies in Ethiopia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And there was some overarching questions that I was exploring, one of which was the proliferation of tools as a result of China. And one of the things that I think became very apparent to me was that it was a much more complicated question than simply looking at one country and one supply chain and sort of saying this is how these technologies are diffusing in different contexts, but also that you can't divorce politics from how these technologies are being used. In each country context, there was a particular political moment or movement or set of ideas or oppressive context that really provided, I think, an impetus for better understanding why technologies are being deployed in the way they were, and to what extent, and what those goals were. And so, as I continue to kind of think about this topic and try to disassemble and make better sense of why different technologies are used, in particular governance environments, I look to the political and I look at political motivations and incentives as a way to better understand that. Final thought, just to kind of emphasize, is that I certainly think, and one reason why at times I've pushed back on the term digital authoritarianism is that I think this is much more than an authoritarianism problem. It is a problem of repression that exists in lots of different contexts. And I think that democracies have a lot to answer for when it comes to scrutinizing their behavior, both as suppliers of invasive technologies, surveillance or otherwise, as consumers, correspondingly, when it comes to utilizing these technologies, oftentimes without appropriate safeguards, without having the right regulatory or legal frameworks, and then also finally as modelers in terms of showing what is possible to other regimes, other countries, saying that even if you are a liberal democratic country with a long tradition of respecting civil rights, civil liberties, that there are still problems endemic in how this is being used, and but that also, yes, you too can use these technologies. That it is okay. It's a legit. It sort of puts forth a legitimizing function, which I think can be very dangerous, particularly for countries with weaker governance structures who are looking for cues, who are looking for signals in terms of whether it is appropriate or not to use certain types of privacy violating technologies, oftentimes in very uncomfortable ways against their citizens. So let me stop there. I look forward to discussion.
That's excellent, Stephen. Thank you. So I want to give Chris and Sarah a chance to react to both of the initial framings, because I think there's a lot there. So maybe Chris, start with you, and then go to Sarah next, and then I have lots more questions for both of y'all.
Great. Well, there's been a lot that's been put on the floor, and I would just I guess I would try and build on what's been shared so far to actually just back up a little bit and explain a little bit how I got into the space, which was to think about, I was doing a degree in political science, using interpretable machine learning to try and better understand how different regimes behaved in different security contexts. And in trying to think through, the more I kind of learned and used AI, it occurred to me that these are really technologies that are designed to allow people to analyze and manipulate information far better than they could otherwise. And so therefore, their political impact was really going to be about information challenges that governments face. And so the starting point for me, and I'm glad kind of Stephen complicated, as did Angela, the idea of digital authoritarianism specific as being a problem specific to authoritarian regimes. There's this broader, class of problem that both democratic and authoritarian regimes face. Both democratic and authoritarian regimes, what they want to do primarily is stay in power. It may not be like a specific kind of democratic president, but the democratic systems seek to perpetuate, the democratic institutions that they rely on. Authoritarian systems, generally speaking, also do the same. And the question is, well, how do you do that? And there's really two underlying information problems that they both face. One is, if you want to keep the regime going or your constitutional order going, you need to be able to identify people who disagree with that order and seek to overthrow it, on the one hand. And on the other, you need to also be able to identify what it is that your population thinks of your performance, and and then the reason for this is, you as a leader need to have some estimate or some ability to understand what the political costs of different policies you put in place are. Even if you're a dictator or authoritarian, you need to know what those, what the tipping point is, where if you push too hard, suddenly there's going to be a popular uprising against you, for example. So both democratic and authoritarian regimes need to be able to identify dissidents, in particular kind of violent dissidents in the case of democracies. And then they also need to be able to understand what's going on in their the kind of aggregate preferences of their population with respect to their policies. And democracy, by and large, has two mechanisms to deal with those. One is, thankfully, by virtue of the legitimacy of our electoral process, generally speaking, democracies, there's a lot of literature on this, have less of a terrorism problem than, or kind of armed conflict problem than authoritarian regimes. It's less of an issue for them to have to deal with people, although I think this may be changing over time. Unfortunately, historically, they haven't had it to focus as much on people who want to overthrow the state. And on top of that, in terms of understanding what their population is thinking, they have elections that really help do that. They also have polling that makes it possible to do that. And part of the reason for that is that when people are asked in a democracy what they think of what the government is doing, generally speaking, they're not afraid of giving the wrong answer, which allows you in the aggregate to get valuable information about from the population directly. If you're in an authoritarian regime, both of those things are much different. You've got an information problem in terms of identifying dissidents who do not want you to find them, and who probably do disagree with you fundamentally about the nature of your regime. And on the other side, you cannot trust the population to tell you what they think of what you're doing because they're afraid of you. And so it becomes very difficult for authoritarian regimes to understand popular preferences about their performance, which is why over the years we've seen these kind of what are called information cascades, when there's a regime that had been seemed to be stable for 30 years just suddenly collapses overnight. Part of that is that the individuals just had preferences that they never really shared with anyone because they were afraid to, but they were all thinking it, and they finally realized that they were all thinking it together. The reason I give all this background is that digital technology provides a solution for authoritarian regimes that they didn't previously have to both of those information challenges. It is, in that way, it's probably a little bit more useful for purely authoritarian regimes than purely democratic ones in managing their democratic or domestic contexts. On the one hand, for all the kind of technologies that Stephen just laid out, can be very useful for identifying and tracking dissidents in your population. Everywhere there's a microchip or a sensor, which is pretty much in everyone's pocket at this point, is an opportunity for surveillance, depending on how these systems are architected. At the same time, the more that we kind of use digital technology to mediate communication between us, though that also becomes a really great way for authoritarian regimes who, provided they're able to monitor that flow of information, to understand what it is that their population is thinking. I don't want to get into the kind of techno-determinism. I think Stephen was kind of really right to point out that this does not mean that kind of authoritarian regimes are now kind of, going to be taking over the world and that it's inevitable. But there are advantages to these technologies that authoritarian regimes have been able to identify and leverage, in particular, some of the leading regimes with a lot of state capacity like we see in China. And so for me, the challenge is, how do democracies address the use of digital technology and the governance of these digital technologies in a way that pushes back on how authoritarian regimes, and I think, as Angela rightly pointed out, even many democracies will sometimes kind of abuse the surveillance capabilities of these technologies in ways that are probably not helpful for the or kind of in ways that run counter to what we traditionally think of as liberal norms and values. So that's kind of a long, I guess, intervention, but that's how I think of the issue, and why I think it's so important, and why I'm so grateful that the AAAS is convening this today, because it's something that we're only going to solve by bringing technologists and political and policy people together.
Thanks, Chris. Sarah, I would pass to you to share any initial reflections.
I don't know what I can add at this point that hasn't been covered by everyone else. So you definitely put me last on that question, Ishan. I'll remember that. But basically, I mean, I agree with everything that everyone said. And there's a lot of things that I can pick up on and talk more about, but I'm sure will come up later in the conversation as we go through this discussion. But I think one of the first points that was brought up by Angela was around the fact that we are essentially, as a society, trying to understand and regulate certain platforms that have existed for a long time, and we're also trying to find and determine regulation for the future. The thing is, technology is developing much faster than policy can around it, and that's one of the biggest problems that we're facing, I think, as a society. The other thing is, in the context of that, essentially, there's the introduction of widespread surveillance in the name of public safety. And we see that a lot in a lot of different contexts. We see people's fears being co-opted to introduce more surveillance. That happened in the US after 9/11, and we saw that being reflected in airports, for example, and how there were more security measures at the airport that have not been rolled back since then. We saw this in 2020 and 2021 with COVID, and people's fears around COVID essentially being co-opted again, and new surveillance technology being introduced in the name of public safety, such as contact tracing apps. Amnesty International, the Amnesty Tech team, Amnesty International at some point did an investigation into some of these COVID contact tracing apps and found that they were really means of surveillance, and they were collecting a lot more information that was necessary. Some of these countries were in the Gulf, and some of these countries were in Europe. So you see it on both kind of what you would think of more like repressive societies versus more liberal societies. And in both cases, governments are introducing contact tracing apps, supposedly in the name of COVID and supposedly in the name of public safety, but that are collecting like way more information that they need to be collecting. And in every case, it was a rather serious breach of privacy, and really an extension of this normalization of the surveillance. And the problem is, like, once you roll out these norms, whether it's more surveillance cameras in the street, again, in the name of public safety, they always get normalized, and it's really hard to roll them back. It really becomes like this slow erosion of public consciousness around what is acceptable and what is really an invasion of privacy. That limit keeps getting pushed and pushed even more, and it's hard for people to essentially come back from that once widespread surveillance is introduced. And we see it introduced essentially in the name of public safety and taking advantage and playing on people's fears a lot. Another thing with the introduction of this type of surveillance or this type of like experimental technology is that it is a means to uphold the status quo of power and to keep the folks that are in power in power. And a few people mentioned that already. And it is a way to continue essentially and enhance the existing repression or the existing inequalities that that are present in a society. In the US, that means targeting specifically people of color, Black people, disadvantaged and marginalized groups, a lot of people that are already heavily surveilled and have been heavily surveilled for decades. Technology comes in, or surveillance technology in this case comes in as a means to continue enhancing that type of repression and the inequality that is currently present through essentially experimental tech, AI, surveillance tech, and a lot of these companies that are developing this type of technology. Not last year, robo-dogs were deployed in low-income communities in New York, and that's a very real reality that people are facing, and that particular population is essentially bearing the brunt of that experimental technology that is being used against them first and then deployed elsewhere. Exactly. And it's not the first time that tech has been used to reinforce that type of like bias and racism. In the US, we've also seen a lot of predictive models being used by the courts for years now to determine bail and sentencing for people. That decision is essentially in the hands of a black box of an AI that is essentially weighing on matters of freedom and captivity, life and death for folks. And then if you zoom out on a global scale, and I think Stephen just mentioned that, but the use of that technology and surveillance then is used by governments and by countries to silence any dissidents and really any threat to their power. When you say a threat to power could mean a journalist, a threat to power could mean an activist, a threat to power could be a human rights defender. And if you take the specific example, for instance, of Pegasus, the spyware that is developed by NSO Group, Israeli cybersecurity company, a big majority of the people that are targeted by Pegasus are activists, are journalists, and are human rights defenders. So threat to power really can mean and can really include, or in a lot of cases, that's what it means. It includes like any activist, any dissident, any journalist, and countries around the world, whether it's like what we traditionally think as an authoritarian regime or a liberal democracy, in both cases are using this technology to protect the status quo of power and to keep certain people away from it.
Thanks, Sarah. So I want to zoom out and summarize a bit of the context that the panelists have shared. And so common themes that have emerged to me is this idea that Stephen pointed out, which is we're living in a moment, and I think the rest of the panelists as well, we're living in a moment where there is a dramatic uptick in both the pace and the sort of use of surveillance technologies broadly across the world, and how this is dramatically impacting the fundamental precepts of what it means to be a democracy, whether it's journalists trying to sort of survive in a world of Pegasus software, or it is, equality under the law with deployments of robodogs in Black and Brown communities, or as Chris pointed out more broadly, sort of the empowerment of the authoritarian model as it relates to democracies in terms of what is a more competitive governance function. Some of the thinking that has been produced by the Biden administration and a lot of scholars that think about this topic is this extent need to lead by example in the face of these challenges and crafting sort of a model that stands up against these challenges and upholds the key principles of democracy. So I'm curious, based on sort of the current response to what democracies have taken. To me, it's focused largely on bans either at the local level, like we should ban facial recognition technology, or at the foreign policy level, like we should ban certain types of companies from exporting or investing in, or US governments investing in these companies. To what extent are those attempts separate from the real conversation, which is this dire need to create an actual alternative model, one that is fit for the 21st century? And how do we get there? Stephen, I'd like to go to you first because I know that you've written a little bit about this idea that there's this extant discussion on principles and how do we actually move from principles of transparency and accountability into actual actions. And perhaps Chris, I may go to you next to share a bit about sort of this disaggregation between these two models that are happening at the domestic front and the foreign policy front. And then I will break it up with our panelists on Zoom as well right after.
Great. Well, I think it's good to kind of go to think about responses. So I'm happy to offer a few brief thoughts on that. Just to put it pretty simply, I would say that under the Biden administration, we've seen some encouraging signs when it comes to at least trying to think through on a higher level what is a proper regulatory approach, what's the appropriate balance between security interests, law enforcement interests, national security, public order, and civil liberties. And so things like the AI Bill of Rights, the Declaration for a Free Internet, these kind of high level principles, having the Summit for Democracies and some of the interesting initiatives that have come out of there, I think are encouraging. But they are very small steps in a landscape that I think demands far greater action. And I mean, if we were to sort of look and ask ourselves realistically, to what extent is the U.S. government leading by example, modeling the type of regulations and behavior that other democracies and other countries can emulate and say, well, this is a way forward in terms of trying to figure out these balances? I would say that that's been fairly insufficient. So, why do I think that? Well, I would say that for a few reasons. I mean, take something very basic like privacy. We are nowhere near having any kind of a national framework when it comes to making basic judgment calls about what ought to be private, how do you define that, what is the responsibility of companies that collect data, and so forth. We're nowhere close to that. And certainly this is not the fault just of the executive. This is a fault of our political system where we can't seem to get the right kind of legislation through and where we've been hamstrung on this issue. But what are we waiting for? If you don't build the foundational building blocks for these technologies, if you don't put in place the right framework, you're not going to make any progress. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about surveillance for a minute. So, obviously there's been a lot of, I think, good developments. And, one of the things I want to highlight that the Biden administration has done well, at least when it comes to symbolically making a move, has been the entity list and placing NSO Group, Kangaroo, and two other spyware entities on this list, which is essentially bankrupted or moved NSO Group close to bankruptcy. So that's great. I would say of all the things one could do on spyware in particular, setting an example for one of the important vendors and showcasing what can happen if you start to cross red lines when it comes to privacy and civil liberties again and again, I think that sends an important signal. But then if we look at other aspects, like let's say the U.S. border, and let's look at some of the technology that's being used there in terms of contracting with Anduril for these giant watchtowers that include infrared radar that's incorporated with drone technology that searches over thousands of kilometers for migrants who are crossing through. What kind of safeguards are we using on that front? What do we know about how these systems operate? To what extent is CBP, which is the agency responsible for it, actually accountable for its actions? We know very little. And that is also another part of the modeling problem that I find, in that you can put in place high-level principles on the one hand, and you can promote those in international fora, and that's extremely important. But you should also be judged by the actions that you yourselves undertake, particularly when it comes to very important policy areas of policy interest and vulnerability, such as your borders. And on that front, I think there's a lot of work to be done. Let me stop there.
I don't really know how to follow that. That was great. One just quick point, one thing that I am just really worried about is the kind of effectively digital walls that you're able to build now as a surveillance capability. If you have cutting edge infrared, you have drones, you have cameras, you're able to create and kind of couple that with autonomous or advanced robotics. you're able to monitor far more vast spaces than you would otherwise. And it's very hard for humans to be able to get around that. And just as an example, like within China, the foot traffic from Tibet into one particular area of India, of people kind of escaping Tibet going there, has dropped by about 90 to 95% since China developed a similar kind of strategy for monitoring the border. It's a way of, there's technologies now that effectively allow you to create digital open air prisons for real, for people in their communities, and it's something that I think we should be alarmed by. As far as the question about the democratic response, I think so far what we've seen is really from the administration, with the exception of the blueprint for Bill of Rights for AI and again the Declaration for the Free and Open Internet. With those exceptions, and even there, I wouldn't say. I mean, it's not a Bill of Rights for AI. It's a blueprint for a Bill of Rights for AI, right? Like it's not. There hasn't been a lot of political capital expended and used to really push through an affirmative agenda for the democratic governance of technology. What we've seen so far is less a policy, in my view, that's counter kind of digital authoritarianism, and more a policy that's really struck at countering China. And there's kind of been this conflation of most of the moves, whether it's export controls like the ones that came out recently. There's been a wide array of policy regulations and policy guidance put in place recently, really aimed at reducing China's access to different kinds of technology. Part of the reason for that is the very legitimate reason that China is using those technologies to create these kind of surveillance architectures that we do need to be worried about. Part of the other broader political calculus, though, behind that is just strategic concerns over the rise of China more broadly, independent of what they're doing with technology. And I would say, so far, I think every administration needs to kind of wrestle with whether they want to prioritize human rights or whether they want to prioritize security concerns in their foreign policy. I think so far what we've seen is a response to this issue that's kind of rooted primarily out of the security and strategic considerations rather than human rights considerations. And I think going forward, one thing I would really, one of the big tells to me, I guess, would be, there's been discussion, a couple of senators, I think, have floated the idea of a new commission on China and responding to China. When I testified a couple of weeks ago on digital authoritarianism, one of the points I tried to make very clearly was have a commission, but have it be on digital authoritarianism. It should not, like, the issue in my view is not necessarily China. It's really these technologies and how they're being used, including by other democracies around the world. So, and hopefully we can kind of make more progress on that front going forward.
So, Nanjala, I want to go to you next because I know that this is something you spend a lot of time thinking about, and you had a chance to share at the top, which is that this is an issue that is affecting all countries and as they sort of implement. And so the path forward requires building an inclusive sort of model that deals with the use of this technology widely. So a bit of a doozy of a question, but what I would like to ask you is, in your research, have you noted or come across any potential solutions in an international context that you think may be sort of predisposed to building that inclusive path forward?
Oh, nice, easy question at 11 p.m. I think that, okay, so I'm speaking in multiple capacities, specifically to answer this question. And while nothing that I say should be attributed to the rest of the high-level advisory board, it is something that we're grappling with. What is a multilateral response to the rise of digital authoritarianism? What does that actually look like? And I think what Stephen said about thinking about the values first before we look at the tech, I think is a really important thing it's not a small point. I think it's something that we really need to sit with. When we look at the impacts of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights on the way in which the human rights landscape has been molded over the last 75 years, it's not perfect. It's not enforceable. It doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, but the normative impact that it's had, the mobilizing impact that it's had, the way in which subsequent institutions have been able to build on that and have a discourse around that, I think is a really important model. And you could say the same thing about the Geneva Conventions, right? There's really no enforcement mechanism for the Geneva Conventions. Like what's happening at the ICC comes through the Rome Statute. And of course, yes, the Rome Statute builds off the Geneva Conventions, but they're different bodies of law. And so I think thinking about the values, what we have not given ourselves time to do internationally and even nationally to some extent is think about what we want tech to represent in our social lives, in our political lives. And I think that creates an opportunity for authoritarian entrepreneurship, right? In the absence of there being sustained, deep discourse, political discourse, engagement on these issues, then the people who want to use this tech for bad find that opportunity. And so now we're kind of like trying to build in reverse. I think that is a model that I think I would want to lean into. And I want to say that there are so many initiatives that are underway right now to address different aspects of technology. What's missing in this space, one big thing that's missing in this space is coordination, and especially coordination from countries that are not the US or China. And I know this is an American conference and it's an American association, but the reason I say that is something that Stephen has pointed out is that the geopolitical tension between the United States and China is making it very difficult to have a meaningful conversation that impacts the rest of us, because we get stuck in the middle and we are unable to articulate a way forward that makes sense for the majority because it gets lost in this conversation. So the example that Stephen gave with semiconductors, right? The semiconductor debate is actually it's perfectly eliminates this tension, because absolutely this technology is being used to build repressive tech both in China and abroad, but it's also being used to build systems that are being used for other things within China, and systems that will be used by the Chinese government in other parts of the world for different uses. And we get stuck in the middle because the end of the Chinese, the contraction of the Chinese tech space is going to have a knock-on space in Zimbabwe, a knock-on effect, for example, in Zimbabwe, in Ethiopia, and all of these other countries. And so it becomes very difficult to have a meaningful engagement. So I stay on the values plane. I think what we need is some kind of really concerted multilateral efforts to define the values of technology and what we want technology to represent. It might seem like a cop-out and it might seem like a mealy-mouth response, but my position has always been that you cannot understand the role that technology will play in a society if you don't understand the society in question. And so we have to foreground the social questions. We can't, digitalization is not a purely economic, it's not a purely technical thing. So why do we always act as if the social questions, the social consequences of digitalization, digital authoritarianism, and all these issues are just too difficult and too mushy and too weird to handle? But you can build a computer that can, solve equations in 0.0003 seconds, then you can figure out justice, right? Then you can give yourself a couple of seconds to think about what you want this tech to represent. So I'm sorry if it's a vague answer, but for me, I think that's kind of where I would want to start. I think let's figure out the social questions. Let's have the messy conversation. Let's have the awkward conversation, and let's be honest about what's happening here. Let's not pretend that, one country is this paragon of liberal democracy when it's selling the technology that's enabling mass death, a couple of 100 kilometers away.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Nanjala. I think the point, especially about geopolitical tensions creating sort of a crowding out effect, is especially well received by at least me, being an American. And so I guess I want to turn to Sarah for a question sort of geared towards this discussion about what are the social norms, but precisely from a technology lens, in the sense that there's been a number of conversations that dictate that, the surveillance technology industry is quite too globalized. And I think even some of the panelists here had suggested that it's quite a complex supply chain. So the idea that an MSO group or a surveillance vendor can really know the end customer or know how their technology is being used is just impossible. And that's a standard talking point from a lot of surveillance industries. Sarah, I know that perhaps more than anyone on this panel, you have spent quite a lot of time dealing with the intricacies of technology. Is that true, or are there other sort of countermeasures that might be able to get more information and thus, to Nanjala's point, sort of craft a sort of normative ecosystem at an international lens on what are the right uses of this tech and what are the wrong uses?
It is definitely true in the sense that spyware companies will use this argument as a cop-out to not hold any responsibility in how their technology is being used. We hear the same thing about the gun industry, right? Of like, we're creating these weapons and we're putting them on the market, and it's not our fault at all if this is being used in schools or being used in whatever. We see the same thing basically with the spyware industry, with the surveillance industry, in which that technology is being developed. There are multiple examples that are incredibly obvious about how that technology is incredibly harmful and can lead to very bad things like the imprisonment of someone or facilitating a genocide. But every time the response from a spyware company will be like, well, it is not, we can't know essentially how the end user or our client is using this technology. I think I want to talk about two things in that bigger context. One is on how certain tech companies are responding to that. The first example here is there is a wide spread of stalkerware that is used by people to monitor, say, their partner, and that is unfortunately incredibly common in cases of domestic violence, domestic abuse situations. For a very long time, antivirus companies and anti-malware companies, such as Malwarebytes or Kaspersky, were not flagging those as spyware or as malware, even though it was defined as such, and even though it is that. But stalkerware was for some reason essentially in a different category. One thing that the EFF worked on, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, was essentially in getting these antivirus and anti-malware company to actually start picking up on stalkerware and report it as such, as stalkerware. And that kind of like shifted the conversation in the industry, one in like naming and shaming these stalkerware companies, and in actually empowering people who had been targeted by stalkerware to know that they were being surveilled by a friend, by a spouse, by a parent, by whoever, essentially. And that kind of like shifted that conversation a little bit, and like had a huge impact essentially on cases of domestic violence and domestic abuse. That's one thing. In the context of Pegasus, and Pegasus essentially being used to target certain people, Apple at some point developed a way to notify, well, one, to like be able to detect Pegasus in certain cases, and two, notify users if their device essentially had essentially Pegasus on it. So this only happened like recently in the past year, but essentially if you were an iPhone user and you had been targeted by Pegasus, if the system was able to detect it, you would get a notification saying that this was on your phone. So tech companies are also kind of taking certain steps to counter, I guess, certain types of surveillance and spyware. And those two examples are like some that come in my mind when I think about essentially like the role of technology and like how certain tech companies are responding to that industry. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, and a little bit of maybe going back to the previous question that you asked about the US and the role in the context of what Biden had said, essentially. And Stephen, you brought this up at some point when you were talking about the fact that the US is like trying to regulate this internationally in some ways by what they did with NSO Group, yet at the same time we're deploying a lot of this technology domestically against certain types of like populations within the US. It is very true that the US, I think, doesn't know what it wants and can't take a position there. And a big part of it is because of the geopolitical tensions. The US wants and is trying to position itself as a beacon of democracy to counter the image of China and what China is doing in this surveillance and like digital authoritarianism world. Yet at the same time is continuing to deploy this technology domestically. One example of it that I find kind of interesting is when I was at OTF, the Open Technology Fund, we receive, the fund that we have to fund technology and research on privacy and security is given to us by the US government. It's basically US taxpayer dollars that are given from Congress to US AGM, the US Agency for Global Media, and then to OTF. And then OTF funds essentially privacy and security technology in the world. And so the US is essentially the government is actively funding the development of technology around security and privacy. Yet at the same time, we have debates domestically about whether or not to have a backdoor into end-to-end encryption in order to help the police track down criminals. Again, it's like this use of like public safety as a means for widespread surveillance. So there's a lot of you definitely see this tension really at a US government level. And also because a lot of the people that are making these decisions don't really understand technology very well, which is why there's certain initiatives like the Tech Congress Fellowship, in which a technologist essentially will be placed within certain offices at a US government level to be able to advise and inform decision makers on the implications of a certain technology and what it means to say, like, we want to ban encryption and what the implications of something like that could be. So it's an interesting dynamic at a US government level. Going back to that question of like what it means to lead by example.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sorry to interrupt you, Sean. I just wanted to add something to what Sarah just said. I think also part of creating the normative context for this is doing things like what we're doing now, which is centering conversations about normative issues and contextual issues just outside the narrow political science, international relations conversations. I talk to a lot of tech people in the same way that Sarah was saying that legislators and politicals don't understand tech. A lot of tech people don't understand politics, and they don't understand what the social implications of the things that they're building is going to be. And I think we have to move past this idea that of hyper specialization, that we're not able to look over the fence and see what people who are have a different technical expertise are working on, and to be able to explain to them, well, this is what this looks like down the line. And especially in the humanities and the social sciences, yes, we're struggling with funding crises and we're struggling with all of this. And it's actually very difficult to be in the humanities and social sciences and dealing with all these issues and seeing tech people basically throwing money into the fire pit. But it's like, I'm doing some work recently on migration and border tech, and people who are working on biometrics and how biometrics are used at the borders, not understanding what it means to be a refugee. A refugee can't vote. A refugee can't demand legislation, protection from the government that they're going into. They can barely survive, the societies that they're living in. And so when the tech people build a tech and they propose solutions and they assume that accountability will come from the state, well, there are entire populations that the state willfully refuses to see and willfully refuses to address their concerns. So to just build on that point, I think thinking outside the lines that we have drawn across our intellectual lives is also part of creating this normative context that makes it possible to shape positive digital futures and to really address the threat of digital authoritarianism.
I mean, plus one on everything you just said. And very much so the fact that also people who develop technology are usually and tend to be usually based in the US or in Western Europe, like in the West, as we want to call it. And they're developing technologies that are then being deployed against the global South, or whatever you want to call that area of the world as well. But the people who are developing this technology do not look like us and do not understand our context. And this technology is being developed here and then deployed in places like Egypt, in places like Rwanda, in places like Palestine, by people who don't understand what it means to be from that community. And sometimes technology is developed really with the best intentions, without really understanding how it can be used then for repression because of that lack of understanding of the context in which it's being deployed. So just wanted to plus one everything you just said.
Totally. There's a reason why artificial intelligence algorithms are historically pretty bad at recognizing darker skin faces. And there's a tons of necessity in the tech development to hold accountability for ethical development, both from surveillance tech companies, but also the folks that design the algorithms and broadly across AI. And to some extent, this conversation has illuminated a lot of hypocrisies between the attempt to solve problems like the U.S. government investing in privacy and security, at the same time looking for sort of backdoors to end-to-end encryption. I want to highlight one other sort of big solution in terms of the response, and perhaps introduce this to the entire panelists to see who bites. But to me, there's one response, which is we should design tech that is capable of monitoring how algorithms are being abused and to be able to design countermeasures like privacy preserving technologies to sort of reduce the impact of surveillance. There's also this question of governance, which is the fact that we haven't actually designed a system in which the use and deployment of surveillance tech in the United States or really across the world lives up to its principles. In my own research, I found that talking from over 40 different activists to industry officials, to foreign policy experts, to law enforcement police chiefs, they all agree on one thing, which is that if you look at the state and local law enforcement's acquisition and deployment of tech, the one word that keeps coming up is it's a total Wild West. And that is a huge problem for leading by example. The one thing that I want to posit to the group is that something that I've been particularly excited about in the last 5 to 7 years is that across 15 US cities, there's been this novel sort of policy intervention called surveillance ordinances, which is a governance intervention designed to engage the local community. It asks questions like, before the law enforcement acquires or deploys the tech, are we really sure about what the intended use cases are? Are we sure about what we want to solve in the community? And have we sufficiently made the community aware before we deploy such a tech? And then while it's being used, while this technology, say, it gets acquired, are we being critical in evaluating how this is being deployed? Is it being primarily deployed in brown and black communities? Is it being deployed and efficacious towards those end objectives? And I think if you look at Oakland, California, which is one of the best examples of this, you've seen that this surveillance ordinance intervention, which created sort of an independent oversight body, has been instrumental at reducing the tensions between the civilian population as well as the police chiefs in terms of designing what is a better modes of engagement. There's a lot of common themes from what we would ascribe to what it means to be a democracy, right? Having transparency, having voice in the decision-making at the local level. So I'm curious for the rest of the group, would you suggest this is the beginnings of some sort of model that could be scaled internationally? And if not, what would you say are sort of the key issues with this type of approach? And feel free, anyone, to start, or I can aside.
I could go first. I think what that proposed solution speaks to, and to me, as someone who works primarily on the political side of tech, is this growing recognition that the most effective government is local first, and that we have to move away from this constantly looking at national governments and start thinking about making government that makes sense for people on a day-to-day basis, because a lot of these surveillance tech, a lot of this, it happens in a very banal way. It's like it's your phone, right? It's not that someone has put 50,000 cameras in your house. It's your phone. It's your Ring camera. It's something that's happening on a very, very basic, or not basic, but it's happening in a very sort of relatively smallish way, and then has these knock-on effects. So I think understanding that local government matters is something that is super important to rethinking about governance on different things, and certainly tech is not separate from that. I think getting ordinances passed and getting local government to work is also part of a bigger story of how do we get people to get governments that like them and care about their well-being and are open to being influenced by those people's interventions or complaints and things like that. We had a lot of conversations in Kenya about surveillance and surveillance tech when our biometric ID was being rolled out. And this is where my work on language comes from, because we were doing all of this advocacy and we were passing a digital ID law, or forcing people to get digital IDs in the absence of a data protection law. So, and it was being built by a French company, and all of that data was being expropriated to France. And so as activists, we're saying, well, this is no, absolutely not on any level. And we rolled out all of these advocacy and campaigns and spent 2 months, and thankfully did get a moratorium on that. But in the process, realizing that we did this entire campaign in English because none of the vocabulary of technology has been translated into Kiswahili. So there was no word for privacy until we ran our project last year to translate it. There was no word for surveillance. There was no word for data protection. There was no, and Kiswahili is the most widely spoken African language in the world. So I think making rights local and making all of these ideas local is a huge part of both creating the normative context that protects rights and defends people against digital authoritarianism, but as you said, starts us off this whole process of reimagining in practical terms what alternatives could look like. Like, what do we actually want this tech to do in our societies, in our communities? And so, yeah, absolutely. I think in principle, moving in that direction could yield a lot of interesting results.
I want to jump in here because you used an example outside of the US context, which I appreciate a lot. That's what I find interesting in this conversation often, is that really this is where it matters whether or not you live and exist within a democratic system. Like, I think of places like Lebanon, when activists come my way, or the civil society, or I'm Lebanese, so that's the context. So Lebanon is my home. I get to be there. I get to work with the civil society there. But when we're discussing essentially pushing back against the rollout of surveillance equipment in the country, or of certain like laws and regulations that the government is trying to pass, we have no avenue, actually, at a local government level. We have no avenue of pushing back against that. I think of places like Palestine, in which they're essentially on the receiving end of whatever the Israeli government wants to do. And again, there's absolutely no democratic avenue to voice that concern or to essentially push back, which is why like places like the US or like Western Europe or like other democratic places are lucky in that sense, because there are these, it's a huge privilege that other places don't have. And Ishan, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but you said like smaller countries essentially look at the example of how certain type of technology is being regulated in other places, such as the US, such as the UK, and then follow along. And that's where that tension, I mean, that's where it becomes really interesting, because in a place like Lebanon, essentially, they will see the US do a certain thing or the UK do a certain thing, and then they will try and do the same. We don't have an avenue of pushing back or of voting at a local level, essentially, to show our discontent with that type of technology. But when that changes in the US or in the UK, I can imagine it does end up influencing places like Lebanon.
So thank you both. I might pitch the question to y'all and to maybe perhaps broaden it, if surveillance ordinances aren't your thing, but what other government-based frameworks or interventions would you want to platform, or what are perhaps ways to increase the rate or raise the profile or the likelihood that surveillance ordinances are scaled both in the US and abroad?
Well, I would actually pick up on Sarah and Angela's great comments in the sense that I think globally cities can be a great laboratory for how to get this right. And I think there's a lot of really amazing efforts that they've just kind of pointed out, or whether it's in Oakland or in Kenya or elsewhere. The one caveat I really want to underscore is that I think kind of relying on local and city governance to surface good ideas is contingent upon marginalized communities within those local jurisdictions having meaningful input in their governance structures. And the reason I bring that up is that one thing I'm really worried about in the United States, frankly, is that we have not always had the best distribution of kind of power at a local level in our history. And I think if you look back at the civil rights movement, for example, part of the reason that it succeeded was that we literally had to bring in the National Guard into certain local communities. And hopefully we don't have to do the digital equivalent of that. But I flag it because I think I am optimistic that places like Oakland, there's some other cities that I think are trialing different areas of bringing in really compelling different ordinance models that we might be able to kind of start to, generate a consensus around how to do this right with. Part of that, I think, will need to kind of be absorbed at the federal level or national level too, to ensure that local areas that maybe don't have the best mechanisms for including marginalized communities within them, that they too kind of have to eventually comply with these kind of ordinances. The other thing I'll just flag briefly is to try and put some meat on the bone in terms of what those ordinances can do. And I think the ACLU, I think, did a great primer on this previously, but things like first of all, just disclosure to individuals that these surveillance systems exist, right? That you're aware of where they are, that what they're doing, that there's clarity among all the users in the community or individuals in the community about what's happening, that there are clear mechanisms for grievance and redress if you feel like something's going wrong, that you have some kind of local mechanism, some board that you can go to raise those concerns with. The other big piece, and this touches on one of the issues around data privacy that Stephen raised earlier, that we don't have national data privacy legislation, which is still mind-blowing to me. The issue of kind of data storage, when there's a surveillance camera somewhere, where is that data stored? Who has access to it? How long is it stored? What are the mechanisms by which that storage is overseen? Where is it, is it going to a data storage or data center out of state or out of the region, right? What kind of governance measures do we need in place for that, the data in transit, if it's not being stored on premise? All of those questions, I think, need to be transparently answered up front to the local community so they have full awareness of how their data is being used by their government or by different, especially if law enforcement is affiliated with it in some way. Without that kind of getting into the nitty gritty of those kind of ordinance details, I think it'll be hard for us to arrive at a really compelling model of how to do this right.
Totally. I'm very passionate about surveillance ordinances, but the idea of meaningfully platforming minority voices is especially true. I know there's research already about sort of white people being okay with the deployment of drones in Black neighborhoods, and that functioning in terms of a local system can be quite problematic. So absolutely.
That's exactly what I'm refer to avoiding.
If you want to.
This one.
Okay, awesome. So I guess at this point, I know we're nearing time, and I want to respect the conference organizers. I want to see if there's any quick questions that we can answer, and if not, we can wrap.
Well, a couple quick comments and then sort of a question, I guess. First, I appreciate Ms. Nanjala's point about objects having an effect on people, as well as people having or technologies having an effect on people. My favorite example, perhaps, is the cotton gin, which I'm not sure Mr. Whitney intended to reinforce the slave system, but when he invented it, it wound up, making cotton production that much more profitable for several decades, and therefore the need for more cotton plantations, yada yada. So that's sort of one. Number two, in terms of solutions, I don't really have any, but I think this conversation is part of it. However, I wouldn't. One thing that we haven't talked about, so it's sort of a question, is money, right? And what some people call surveillance capitalism. A lot of this discussion has been about the state or international level discussions and principles and so forth, but perhaps somebody wants to talk about money and whether there are effective means of, frankly, undercutting or limiting the ability of companies to make money off of my, in quote, data. I noticed, for example, that Google recently had some ads talking about how they protect my data, which is fascinating because it's really my data. And there are data brokers, if not Google, that are collecting this and selling it amongst themselves. Why am I not getting a piece of the action, right? Or if it is my data and I truly own it, right? Then again, do they have the right to get this data? I mean, I've literally asked people who are members of the American Bar Association this question: who owns this digital data, for example? They did not come up with any clear answer whatsoever. So basics, right? Property law, contractual law, financial law, financial issues. I don't know whether anybody wants to address that. And in terms of the United States, we have the 4th and 5th Amendment. It applies to the government, but perhaps the simple answer is to have a constitutional amendment, which will require companies to get bench warrants before they can do any surveillance or put in any spyware. It might eviscerate entire industries, But anyway, I'm throwing that out. If you all want to discuss the economic dimension to all this, thank you.
I also saw one more person who may want to ask a question.
That sounds great. If there's someone else, please feel free to come up or to shout it. That's fine too.
Hi. Sorry, I missed a little bit of this. Maybe it was talked about, but I did hear the reference to a lot of the work in tech coming from folks who are not in the global south. But we've had some brilliant work by folks from India and other places in that part of the world. And I'm wondering, from what you folks know, what kind of movement is there among people in the technology industry who know its potential and its power, and who indeed work on this, who are dealing with some of these issues? They are from the global south. They work in the global south. They work internationally, and they're often from marginal communities, and they've done well because of their energy and their intellect, but they know things at an intimate way if they want to keep them in mind.
So I'm happy to take the first question briefly and then let others pitch in. But Angela, I think you may be most predisposed for the second one. So great question. I think the idea of data brokers was sort of out of scope for this discussion, but I think is quite relevant to the overall ethos of democracies. I think one thing that's perhaps important was noted by the panelists is probably central and why the ABA probably said, there isn't really a path forward here is because there is no national data privacy law. And so to whatever extent that is a vehicle to entertain discussions like, what are data trusts and how much value can we put in, not in just a single bit of data, but in terms of the broader sort of totality of what data there is about Ishan or Stephen or Chris. I think that's perhaps a model, because I think getting paid for individual bits is perhaps, as if you get an email to join a class action lawsuit. It's oftentimes you just delete the email. I think more broadly, there's this issue that I think Sarah had pointed out, which how can we incent companies like Apple to develop the tools so that they can alert you in terms of countermeasures to surveillance. That was an example I had no idea about, but creating more of a market incentive is really important for this type of countermeasure. And as far as I know, the Open Technology Fund is really the only sort of primary funder for this type of tech. And if you look at the surveillance industry, sort of all roads point to this race to invasiveness, that we need to develop more and more invasive tech, and that's how we stay competitive. So what I'm concerned about from a financial standpoint is really the market incentives to develop the tech itself. And I would let anyone else sort of pitch in as well.
I mean, maybe just very quickly to say that it is a very lucrative industry. I mean, that's a reality. These companies make a ton of money doing this type of work, and then with that money do also a lot of lobbying. So it is an incredibly lucrative industry, and that is not going to change until there is regulation at an international scale or even a domestic scale. Like Stephen brought up the example again of NSO Group and what the Biden administration did. That was huge, and that is leading essentially that spyware company close to bankruptcy.
Just to add to that conversation, I think, well, there's two pieces. One piece is that in our report with Advox, with the Unfreedom Monitor, we do spend a lot of time talking about private capital and the role of private capital in shaping interests in the with relation to digital authoritarianism. A lot of times it's government to company deals. They're not generally government to government deals. There are some exceptions to this, but generally tends to be either individual ministries or like special offices in the office of the president or the police or things like that will purchase this technology directly from private companies. So we do spend a little bit of time in our report talking about that. I think another piece of that, though, is I just echo, it is absolutely, capital is part of the conversation, and it's definitely something to pay attention to. I think in relation to the question about the global South, there's two pieces to this. One piece is that there are a lot of people who have been working on countering digital authoritarianism in the global South since before many people in the West realized that it was a problem. There are thousands of people in Egypt who are still in jail right now because of their work during the Arab Spring. There are thousands of people, in Bahrain, in Zimbabwe, there are so many countries where people have been raising the alarm about this issue and have not had the kind of support that they needed to be able to really make an impact. So absolutely. And then there are a lot of people in the global south who work for tech companies. What makes it very difficult is that that honeymoon period where we sold working for tech companies as this utopic ideal still persists in a lot of the countries of the global south, because these are incredibly well-paying jobs. They have a lot of access, and they have a lot of privilege that comes with it. And they tend to cleave onto pre-existing cleavages. They tend to flow across pre-existing cleavages in certain societies. So for example, you hear a lot about people in India talking about casteism or casteism in India, and social networking companies like Facebook and Twitter. So these are Western companies that come into these societies and don't have a sufficient awareness of these pre-existing cleavages and tend to perpetrate these cleavages. You see, when Facebook operates in African countries and they have no context of ethno-nationalist tensions, and so they don't realize that the content moderation team is made up entirely of people of one ethnicity who don't speak the language of another ethnic group. And so it's what Sarah was saying before about there being a sort of social context that tech companies are not necessarily alive to, and the harm that comes from that. You've seen Rana Ayoub's experience with Facebook in India, with Twitter in India, and sort of getting shadow banned for her criticism of the ruling party in India. That wasn't done out of California. That was done in India. That was a choice that was made by Twitter in India. In Nigeria, where we had the End SARS movement, which was asking for the end of police brutality and getting shadow banned on Instagram, that's not being done in Menlo Park. That's being done in Nigeria. And so it's not to, I think there isn't a simple lens. There is agency, and agency kind of moves in different directions. Some people use their agency to mobilize against digital authoritarianism, and some people use their agency to enable it. And some people are really just navigating an economic context in which there haven't been new jobs in the country since the 80s. And whatever jobs exist don't have healthcare, don't have benefits. I always give the example, I go to a lot of digital rights conferences, and there was one conference that happens every 2 years. And one year there were 20 people from Kenya, and the next year I was the only person who wasn't working for Facebook, Facebook's public policy team. And so this is the context that people are trying to navigate their economic and their social pressures that, again, I go back to what I said before. We have to stop thinking about digitalization and digital as a purely economic phenomenon, and we have to really start to lean into these uncomfortable social questions. The same way that the gentleman gave the example of the cotton gin and the impact that it had on slavery. We really have to start leaning in on these contextual social issues. What is this moment in history? What inflection point are we sitting in? We know we're sitting in one. What is it going to be about?
I couldn't think of a better way to end. Thank you, Nanjala. And I wanted to thank our amazing panelists for your time this evening. As well as the AAAS team. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Jonathan. This has been a wonderful conference. Just a quick note, I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, so if you have more questions, we are hosting an open bar tab at Fig and Olive, which is about a few minutes walk away, with some of our colleagues who are there to have plenty more and to continue the conversation there. So thank you all for attending, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for this incredible conversation.